The 5th generation was a truly fantastic era in gaming. 2D games were really starting to show their stuff, while 3D gaming was taking shape 1 year at a time. When it comes to the console wars of that generation, we all know how things turned out. Newcomer Sony and their PlayStation blew everybody out of the water to become the first game console to sell over 100 million units. Nintendo and Sega were mostly vying for second place, in due part to the Nintendo 64 having a delayed release in addition to sticking to cartridges, while the Sega Saturn was virtually one debacle after another. However, its first couple years marked a very weird point in the gaming industry. Before those three consoles would duke it out over the 5th generation, you had the newcomer 3DO, which, while a total bust, still sold some decent numbers and was the strongest system on the market at the time, an old stalwart Atari with the Jaguar, which was a dumpster fire from the word go.
But there was also another company that tried their hand at this era, one that was actually a holdover from the 4th generation.
That was the Nippon Electric Company, known by its abbreviation NEC.
If that sounds familiar, it's highly likely because of the Turbografx. While it was a bit of a bust outside Japan, it was a major success in its home country, such that there was a successor system developed for it, a console almost completely forgotten today. That was the pcfx, a very ill-fated system pretty much since it launched. I've been waiting for just the right time to make this video, as this is a system that definitely deserves attention. And as I upload this on the 30th anniversary of its launch in Japan, I can't think of any better time to talk about it. This is the tale of the forgotten successor to the Turbografx, the NEC PC-FX. But before I begin, I would like you to consider hitting that subscribe button if this video turned out to be worth your time. As a one-man operation, any support is appreciated, and I give my thanks in advance if you do so. To tell the tale of the PC-FX, we need to go back to about 1990. The PC Engine is doing quite well in Japan, and as a result, NEC and Hudson have formed a pretty strong business relationship. At some point around this time, somebody says we should probably get ahead of the curve and try to make a successor system to the PC Engine. Both companies eventually agree, and over the course of 1990 and 91, they get to work on the prototype system, with Hudson providing the custom chipset and NEC doing the rest. Eventually, at the start of 1992, it all comes together to become what they call the Tetsujin, translation Iron Man. When trying to gather interest for the system, 3 games were displayed. 2 of them were simple tech demos, but the third one was what got heads really turning. The game in question appeared to be an updated version of Star Soldier in full 3D. Well, not quite. It was actually 3D objects plastered onto a pre-rendered background, kinda like Sylphie for the Sega CD. Even with the illusion, it was enough of a ruse to gather enough interest that NEC and Hudson were both confident that, yeah, this might actually work. The system was originally intended to release in late 1992. As that time approached, however, they decided to push it to around spring 1993, citing a lack of completed games. Okay, fair enough. However, that time frame came and went as well, and that's when rumors started to come around. Many speculated that NEC and Hudson were a bit hesitant on releasing a successor system while the PC Engine was still doing rather well in Japan. However, what many failed to realize was that NEC had quite a lot of fighting within itself at the time. Not to mention pulling a Sega with their Supergraphics, which was a total dumpster fire for a number of reasons, and wanting to pull out of the North American market due to the Turbografx 16's failure. So with nobody given the green light to release the Tetsujin, it just sat there as new competition made its presence known. The release of the FM Towns Marty would officially christen the 5th generation, but more importantly, the 3DO and Atari Jaguar were coming out as well. As 1994 rolled around, Hudson simply continued to make games for the PC Engine, while NEC, well, they still had their heads in the fucking sand regarding the Tetsujin. What was once a fascinating system in the middle of 1992 was aging and already being outperformed by systems on the market, particularly the 3DO. The release of the specs for the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation would eventually be the slap that brought NEC back to reality. NEC and Hudson both realized that Tetsujin wasn't going to work in the current conditions, so they had to go back to the drawing board. The main problem with doing this at this point, however, was that because they sat on the Tetsujin for so long, there was no time to just start from scratch. Instead, they chose to modify the original Tetsujin architecture. The original custom chipset was streamlined to a single coprocessor and a 32-bit CPU, while the exterior was transformed into what would eventually be the final product. It's around this time that the working title FX came into play, and after some name-checking with the PC Engine, it officially became the PC-FX in early 1994. The PC-FX would make its social debut at the Tokyo Toy Show in June 1994. It's here that the system competed for consumer attention against not just the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, but also the Bandai Palladium, which was a game console marketed as mostly an educational multimedia machine, and the Neo Geo CD, which was SNK's attempt to make their outrageously expensive games a little bit more reasonable to the masses.
Fortunately, the PC-FX would get its share of attention, though a lot of it was ridiculed because of the system's design. It looks like a tower PC. Okay, to be fair to it, NEC, outside the game console industry, was mostly known for their computers. The PC-8800 series dominated much of the Japanese home computer industry over the course of the 80s, and the PC-9800 series was still in production at the time. In addition, the PC-FX was intended to be an upgradable system, kind of like, well, a tower PC. It sounds like a good idea on paper, but that's really a caveat for another major issue the PC-FX had that wouldn't get noticed until months later. It did not have a polygon generator.
You what?
Oh dear. This is gonna suck. So, for the lack of a polygon generator, NEC doubled down on what was a hot trend at the time: full motion video. At the time, the most common video encoding format was the MPEG format. It would get the job done, but more often than not, the video had a grainy resolution and low frame rates. If one was lucky, it would cap at just 24 frames per second. NEC said fuck that format and instead used a more memory-intensive motion JPEG format. Two specific graphics chips would convert the JPEG images into video format, while the system itself ignored the CPU bus and instead sent image information directly to the video out through just a few necessary coprocessors. This resulted in not just higher quality animation, but the system was able to run it at a consistent 30 frames per second. When it came to video playback, the PC-FX was second to no one. Beyond that, because the system didn't have a polygon generator, NEC stuck to the original Techigen format of using pre-rendered polygons. The game shown at the PC-FX's booth was a game called FX Fighter, a game deliberately made to steal the thunder from Sega's Virtua Fighter, which ironically was also on display at the convention. FX Fighter really fascinated people, and it contributed to expectations heading into the console's upcoming launch. Even though the PC-FX would not be backwards compatible with the PC Engine or PC Engine CD, and even though NEC and Hudson both knew the system was quite underpowered, it had its audience. For the next 6 months, the console was marketed across Japan. However, all that early hype was as good as it was going to get for the PC-FX, as consumers and developers alike would soon realize it got 99 problems and NEC is all of them. On the 16th of December 1994, NEC announced the final discontinuation of the PC Engine, allowing the PC-FX's launch to go full steam ahead. The PC-FX would finally be released to the public on the 23rd of December 1994 at a price of just under 50,000 yen. If the console released outside Japan, which would have occurred no later than the middle of '95, rough price tag estimates for the period would have put it at about $600 had it come out to North America, and possibly 400 British pounds if it entered the PAL territories. If those numbers sound outrageous to you, you're not alone. I thought they were pretty bonkers as well. So I took a dive and quickly discovered why I got those numbers. The power of the Japanese yen in 1995 was a total outlier. The year prior marked the first time the US dollar was worth less than 100 yen since the conversion rates began fluctuating in 1971, and it would toe around the 100 yen line for much of the year. And while the British pound stayed above 150 throughout 94, it did drop under that for a couple days in August 93. Come the start of March of 95, those exchange rates cratered to as low as 82 per dollar and 131 per pound respectively. For the next 6 months, those exchange rates stayed firmly under 90 and 140. It wouldn't go back to what it was until the middle of September. Those 6 months contributed to a yearly average of 94 yen to the dollar and 148 to the pound respectively. Numbers that wouldn't even be sniffed at until 2009. Anyway, beside the point, the PC-FX launched with 3 games. Battle Heat, a full-motion video fighting game, which, yes, does sound ridiculous. Susugyo 2, a classroom life simulator. And Team Innocent, a sci-fi style survival horror game not all unlike Resident Evil before Resident Evil actually existed. Of the 3 launch games, this is easily the best one. The 3 games were all fine and dandy, but what most of those interested in the system were wondering was, where the hell was FX Fighter? Let's just say the lack of that game on release was the least of its problems, as for the next 15 months, the decisions made for it behind the scenes turned a system that was underpowered but had some potential into a complete shit show. First things first, regarding FX Fighter. NEC decided to quietly cancel it. Wait, dude, what the fuck are you doing? This was the game that was getting the PC-FX its well-needed attention. It'd be like Sony demoing Battle Arena Toshinden at the Tokyo Toy Show and then axing it after the system launched. The second major shakeup was their development and publishing guidelines being produced for the system. Put simply, it was almost mandatory that any game produced for the system required some kind of pre-rendered animation, giving it a quick reputation as an anime machine. While the guidelines did cater to the strengths of the PC-FX, a la video playback, this put third parties, and especially Hudson, in a bit of a quandary. For Hudson, the guidelines meant they had to support the PCFX without its best-known franchises. Adventure Island? Negative. Bomberman? Nope, no dice. Even the original PC Engine mascot in Bonk wasn't getting on the system. Instead, the PCFX's mascot was a blue-haired girl named Rolfie, a girl who mostly appeared on the Anime Freak CDs, which were essentially magazines in a CD format, though she would eventually get her own game. Regardless, those two things hindered the console big time. By the end of 1995, just a year after it launched, only 15 games were available for the system. 15! Fuck, even the Atari Jaguar had more games released in that time span. The audience that had interest in that system, they just didn't care anymore, as it sold less than 100,000 units by the end of 95. You can just hear the air raid sirens going off within NEC at this point. They continued to shoot themselves in the foot and then got really desperate. While there were potential hints of this being a thing since the first Anime Freak CD, which released in August of 95, it wasn't until the middle of 96 where NEC went full mask off and opened the floodgates to what resulted in the PCFX's lasting legacy. Now those that know the PCFX well, myself included, can certainly downplay what I'm about to say. Nothing I say, or anyone else will say to defend this system, will ever change the reputation this console has. It is a stigma that simply won't go away. Alright, you ready for it? Okay. They tried to turn to hentai to get something going on the system. Yes, really. NEC actually pushed for some eroge to get on the console, mostly ports of PC-98 games. Now, having to stoop as low as turning to hentai to push your product is definitely embarrassing. If you think that's sad, well, that's not actually the sad part. The real sad part was that even that didn't work! I'm not even joking. You'd think that would actually do something, but it barely did a thing. I can't even make this shit up. This console was actively turning to adult content, and it was still running the tank.
You what?
How is that possible? How do you even manage this? What the fuck? If even uncensored anime mountains can't push your product by even a tiny bit, your product is getting absolutely steamrolled by the You're Fucked mobile. And that's exactly what happened to the PCFX. The console already had a tough road back when it was announced at the Tokyo Toy Show, at a time where the gaming industry really didn't know where the direction was going. Hell, even in 95, full-motion video games still had their prevalence. The system itself was intended to be upgradable, like, well, a tower PC. There were actually rumors that a 3D graphics generator was in the works around this time, but unfortunately it never came to pass, as well as any other potential options like connecting it to PC-98 computers. Matter of fact, the only peripheral that got out that even did such a thing was a mere memory-saving module. While I'm talking about all this, I should also briefly mention the PCFX Game Accelerator, which was a literal expansion card for PC-98 and some DOS computers. Of course, this lets you play PCFX games on an actual PC. Not surprisingly, this thing rode the tanks as well. Regardless, this system actually had some potential, and had it released in its original Teijin format back in the summer of 93, we would be telling a very different story. Instead, NEC simply had their heads in the sand, shot themselves in the foot repeatedly, and ultimately sold the console's soul to hentai. While actively having that type of content could have been a potential selling point for the PCFX in some way, shape, or form, it wasn't even unique in taking that direction. The 3DO and Sega Saturn were offering the same exact thing. Matter of fact, if I'm looking at this right, the 3DO was the last home console to feature adult content in North America, since the ESRB would put a stop to that after it formed in late 94. As for the Sega Saturn, those that know their imports real well could recognize the system's rating labels. Most games feature this green label, which indicates all ages. If you go real deep into it, you may come across the yellow label, which is essentially the equivalent of the ESRB's M rating, PAL Region's 16 rating, or Japan's current rating system being D. And then even deeper than that, you've got the red label, which of course is the equivalent of the adults only, 18, and Z ratings. The Sega Saturn mostly censors its naughty content to a considerable degree, even if they were PCFX games that got ported onto the system later on. As a result, very few games actually got the red label. Wait a minute, Atlas Publishers game? What the fuck? As you might expect, the red label games all feature uncensored nudity, except for one, which surprisingly is Mortal Kombat 2. So while the 3DO was all but discontinued by the middle of 1996, the Saturn was still going strong, and for the weirdos who thought this type of content was in their alley, they either stuck to their home computers or bought a Saturn, especially since some PCFX games would get on the system anyway. By this point, just about zero fucks were given for the PCFX. It continued to ride the tanks throughout 1996, and by the middle of 1997, it was clear to both NEC and Hudson that the writing was on the wall. At the end of February 1998, NEC announced the discontinuation of the PCFX after just over 3 years on the market. The final game released for the system was First Kiss Story, released on the 24th of April 1998, bringing the PCFX's final software library total to 62. And that was it, not just for the intended successor to the PC Engine, but also the relationship between NEC and Hudson, as well as the former's position in the console industry. For NEC, they would continue producing PC-98 computers until the end of October 2003. They're still around today, having celebrated their 125th anniversary of operation on the 17th of July this year. However, their prevalence isn't exactly as obvious as it was back in the 90s. Nowadays, they focus on telecommunications and server infrastructure. As for Hudson Soft, they would continue making games as a third-party company while slowly being absorbed by Konami until finally merging with them in 2012. As a result, Konami technically has the rights to PCFX content. So if you ever wondered why the Turbografx never had a successor console, well, you got your answer here. They actually did. But it was the equivalent of a nuclear bomb going off in the middle of God's nowhere in the Pacific, a sight seen only by few. Now, in terms of unit sales over the course of its 3-year run, it's not exactly concrete how many units got sold during that time span. Some sources simply put the units sold claim at just 100,000 and was done with it, maybe as high as 110, maybe 120,000. One source puts it as high as 300,000, but the absolute maximum claimed in terms of units sold is no higher than 400,000. No matter what the number is, that is horrendous. In a lot of ways, this system is actually comparable to the Atari Jaguar. Both systems were intended for release in late 1992, but got pushed back due to issues. Both systems looked underpowered compared to the 3DO of all things. Both parent companies mismanaged the hell out of these systems over their first year in production. Both consoles have at least one embarrassing moment regarding their higher-ups. For NEC's case, it was turning to hentai, while Jaguar's case was the infamous Next Generation interview. Both consoles couldn't crack 70 games in their entire library, couldn't sell even 500,000 units, crashed and burned after just over 3 years on the market, and ultimately was the last major console for both companies. Just how closely these two failures are tied to the hip is staggering. Even though the Atari Jaguar does get mentioned on occasion, considering the system tanked as hard as it did and remained a Japanese exclusive, maybe it's not all that surprising to know that just about everybody forgot this system ever existed. However failure this console may be, it should not be a system that is forgotten, for a really good reason. The PCFX is a fantastic period piece of what was one of the strangest periods in video game history. Back then, nobody really knew what the direction of the 5th generation was going to be. Was the future going to be full motion video or 3D polygons? NEC and Hudson simply bet on the wrong horse. If the PCFX had released in the middle of '93, we may have been telling a bit of a different story. Alas, it is what it is. Alright, you've heard me ramble like a madman about this console, its history, and its reputation. You've probably had this question on your mind for quite a while now. Is there anything on the PCFX actually interesting? Okay, I'm going to admit right out of the gate, because this system is an obscure Japanese exclusive, approaching it isn't all that easy. The majority of its library consists of RPGs and visual novels, two genres that rely heavily on text. If you don't have a firm grasp of Japanese, getting through these games is agony incarnate. Adding on to this, out of the 62 titles that comprise the PCFX's library, only 4 have had fan translations of any kind published, the most recent being Farland Story FX in March 2021. If you can get past that, there are a couple neat titles, such as an enhanced version of Langrisser 2 and Miraculum. For those that did give the PCFX a try, it's almost universally known for 3 games in particular. First is Chip Shot Kick, an arcade-style game that is very similar to Bubble Bobble, more specifically Parasol Stars. Though the less I say about its animated sections, the better. Jojen Heike Zeragar, which, while the PC Engine is known for being a shoot-'em-up haven, this is the only one for the PCFX in a cruel twist of irony. It's also one of the 4 games to get an English translation, and the only one of those 4 to get the full treatment and subtitles in its animated sequences. And finally you have Kishin Doji Zenki FX Vajra Fight. Yeah, that's about the full side. A 2D beat-em-up that has had some comparisons to Guardian Heroes on the Sega Saturn. I might come back to these games as independent videos. After all, my main focus for this one was the console itself. The point is, there is stuff here on the PC-FX. Just like every other game console, you just have to give it a chance, take a dive, and eventually you might find something. Though, considering this console was a Japanese exclusive, it's definitely not going to be for everyone. I'll admit that at least. While the PC-FX was indeed a total bust, it still is a novelty piece of an interesting age in the industry. No matter what your view of the console is, whether it be an ill-fated system that was brutally fucked over by NEC's decisions, an abomination of a console that should never have existed to begin with, or simply the hentai console, I think you and I can both agree on one thing. The NEC PC-FX is without a doubt one of the game consoles of all time. Hey everybody, Eclipse14 here, thanks for watching. Well, that was a bigger rabbit hole than I realized. I knew a good chunk about the system beforehand, but getting source material was an absolute nightmare and brought some interesting curiosities. At least I got the whole thing dealt with. If you like what you saw, feel free to drop a like, and if you think my work is worth your time, please hit that subscribe button, I would greatly appreciate it. Now if you'll excuse me, I think I'll go play some Zengi.